Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to the Society of the Cincinnati for inviting me to speak about my new book, The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History. And I'd like to begin with a story that I first came across in the Maine Historical Society about a decade ago. Uh, this is Eliza Wadsworth. She was a 20-year-old woman who lived at home with her family in Portland, Maine around the turn of the 19th century. And in January 1800, having been so moved by the recent death of General Washington, she asked her father Peleg, a former Continental Army officer who was then serving in Congress in Philadelphia, for a memento of the Revolutionary hero. Peleg was so moved by his daughter's request that he actually wrote to Martha Washington to ask for something on behalf of his daughter, and was stunned a few weeks later to find that Mrs. Washington had actually sent a lock of Washington's hair. Shortly after, Eliza received a package in the mail from her father, and inside were two envelopes, one marked, "Read this first." And in that envelope, a letter from her father read, "You expressed a strong wish for some relic of General Washington. I will not detain you longer, but leave you to unfold the secret." Eliza was so stunned by this gift that she wrote, "How shall I duly honor the relic? I feel as if it was too great for me to possess. I want to give thousands who have never had the happiness of seeing General Washington the satisfaction of viewing this lock. I am singularly happy." But her health was unstable, and just 2 years later, she was dying from tuberculosis at the age of 22 when she drafted a note about her most prized possession. "The hair of General Washington I leave in the care of my sister Zilpa, and I wish it may be preserved in our family while it can be kept safe." Eliza died on August 1st, 1802, and her letters and the lock of hair were preserved within the family. Her sister later passed them down to her son, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who ultimately donated them to the Maine Historical Society, where they remain today. This story, Eliza's story, it's about more than just a young woman and a lock of hair. It's emblematic of the deeply emotional connection to the memory of the Revolution that Americans began to forge early in the 19th century, primarily once they started to realize that the revolutionary generation was rapidly disappearing. But that emotional connection has continued generation after generation throughout American history. And so I want to begin my talk tonight by exploring this sort of phenomenon, this unique emotional relationship that Americans have had with their revolution for nearly 250 years. Because I think that both historians and citizens have often taken this for granted and not really thought more deeply about it. But I think that if we more deeply understand that relationship, that it has much to tell us about the past, the present, and the future, particularly as we continue barreling our way toward the 250th anniversary of independence. The memory of the American Revolution, that is how it's remembered in our political culture and in our popular culture, is our national origin myth. Now, historians typically use the term myth in a rather simplistic way to mean a widely held misconception or an inaccurate or exaggerated story, right? Legends and lies is in this one title. But the primary definition of a myth, particularly an origin myth, is a story that explains how something came to be, and also helps to define the character of that society or people. And so to mythologize the revolution is not merely to tell exaggerated stories about it, but it's to tell the story of the revolution in a way that explains how the United States came to be, to define the American character, and to set the agenda for the nation's future. Like ancient peoples created mythologies to explain how the natural world originated and how it worked, we have mythologized the revolution to explain how our nation originated and how it should work. Ancient myths about the origin of city-states and empires played a crucial role in defining what it meant to be, for example, a Roman or an Athenian or a Spartan. And these stories were passed down through generations in poetry and prose, represented in civic buildings, commemorated in civic and religious rituals. And often there were multiple competing versions of these myths because they changed over time as circumstances changed, and because new tellings emphasize different aspects of these stories. And the same has been the case for the popular memory of the American Revolution. And so I want to really explore what it actually means that we have mythologized the revolution, how that has actually worked in practice, and then what it can tell us about Americans' relationship to their revolution. Myths are first and foremost stories. And like so many good stories, the tale of the American Revolution has often been told in 3 acts. The first act focuses on the coming of the revolution. It features a succession of familiar legislation and events, including the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, up to the declaring of independence. The second act features the war and is typically structured around a timeline of famous battles: Brooklyn, Trenton, Saratoga, Yorktown. The third and final act recounts how in the 1780s the weakness of the Articles of Confederation led to the Constitutional Convention, and ultimately the culmination of the revolution with the Constitution. Right? This story has a logical beginning, middle, and an end, and for that reason, it gives the telling of the revolution a sort of inherent literary quality. But if we go a bit deeper, we find that the way Americans have told this basic story has followed a familiar form. The hero's journey is a common narrative structure in Western mythology that was first identified by Joseph Campbell in the mid-20th century. And put simply, it's a sequence of common plot points that Campbell found in his studies of many hero myths. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, this structure has been used by writers and filmmakers, many of whom were explicitly influenced by Campbell's work, in such iconic products of popular culture as Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, The Matrix, and many others. And so I want to suggest that how Americans have told the story of the revolution for nearly 250 years has roughly followed this traditional Western mythic narrative structure. At the start, the hero, or in our case, the revolutionary generation, receives a call to adventure. Right? After a number of attempts in the 1760s by the British Empire to exert greater control over the colonies, in 1774, Parliament passes the infamous Coercive Acts, and this unprecedented attack on colonial self-government leads to the creation of a Continental Congress. Typically, the hero initially resists the call to adventure, and of course, throughout 1774 and 75, Congress refuses to consider independence, right? Instead, focusing on trying to reconcile with Britain. But eventually, the hero accepts the call and sets off on the adventure by crossing the threshold into the unknown world. And of course, in July 1776, the revolutionaries accept the call to adventure by declaring independence and crossing the threshold into the unknown world of independence and war. The hero then typically goes through a series of challenges and temptations. And for the revolution, these trials are represented by many of the war's battles. And though they're rooted in actual history, some of the war's most famous stories feature in their retelling mythical themes and near mythical scenarios. If we think about the Continental Army's daring escape during the Battle of Brooklyn, right? So the story goes, penned in along the East River by the British Army, George Washington engineers the crossing of his entire army in one night under the cover of darkness and thanks to an opportune fog, thereby avoiding a likely early end to the revolution. And similarly, there is the successful attack on Trenton, Christmas Day in 1776, mythically depicted in Emanuel Litz's famous 1851 painting, when Washington crosses the Delaware River with his ragtag army at night and scores an important victory against the feared Hessians mere days before the army's enlistments are about to end. These tales like this, have lent themselves well to the mythologizing of the revolution and to the founders in our popular memory. And though the stories are rooted in actual historical events, they have been told and retold in ways that lend them mythical connotations, including telling them as though they represented direct intervention by God. And that lends a sort of predestined or even providential nature to the origin myth. Now, often early in the journey, the hero receives guidance from a mentor and later receives the timely aid of a helper. And for the revolutionaries, that helper was France. And like the many times in mythical stories and folk tales when the helper shows up at just the right moment to make victory possible, the French fleet arrives at the Chesapeake Bay from the Caribbean just in time to surround Cornwallis's British army and make the siege of Yorktown possible in 1781, effectively ending the war and securing American independence. Now, as a result of this, as a result of the adventure, the hero often undergoes a process of revelation and rebirth. In our story, the revelation of having secured independence leads former British subjects to be reborn as American citizens. They then undergo a transformation into a new confederation of states. But as they quickly come to realize that the new government is not working, they reach the moment of atonement and call a constitutional convention in 1787. And once the atonement is complete, they receive the, quote, gift of the goddess, in our story, the Constitution, and return to the known world, which is now changed for the better, thanks to the hero having undertaken their adventure and the illuminating revelations that they bring back with them. Now, because of its prevalence and its longevity in Western culture, the hero's journey as a narrative form feels familiar to us even without being explicit. The mythical, literary, and religious traditions of the West have sort of culturally hardwired us to in such a way that this story structure elicits intense emotional responses, and not least because hero myths were part of ancient religions and civic histories. And that the story of the revolution has often been told like this, I think helps us better understand Americans' unusual emotional connection to the revolution. These stories kindle intense emotional connections in part because they're usually intended to foster one's sense of belonging to a community. And after all, Americans have long identified with a cast of unlikely underdogs who become larger-than-life heroes by surviving a series of trials and achieving a seemingly providential victory against all odds over the world's most powerful evil empire. And there is a real civic power that comes from individuals collectively imagining themselves as the descendants of heroes who achieved the impossible. Many generations of Americans who have encountered this narrative of the revolution, particularly in their youth, have had emotional experiences akin to those that modern audiences have had to Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings, or Harry Potter. And this mythologizing of the memory of the revolution has historically provided a nation that is still relatively young with an epic mythical past, replete with heroes and villains and peril and daring escapes aided by a seemingly enchanted natural world, and meaningful revelations about how the world or the nation should be. And throughout, there has always been a sense that good and evil exist and that they're clearly delineated. And most importantly, that the former always wins out over the latter. It is a myth of the beginning of a new age. And by casting Americans as both its heralds and its heirs, the nature of the popular memory of the revolution has lent a weight laden with meaning, purpose, and destiny to the American identity for more than 2 centuries. And this is in no small part why the revolution has been so central to our politics, culture, and national identity for nearly 250 years. And I think that understanding the form in which the story of the revolution has been told, therefore, helps us to understand American emotional connections to their origin story, as well as their sense of the exceptional nature of those origins. Now, there is actually a field of study known as fandom studies, which studies what's called fan culture and explores how people and groups relate to these kinds of stories and other facets of popular culture. how they express their emotional connections to them, and even more, how these connections influence their personal identities and lead them to form communities with their fellow fans. One of the most common ways that they do these things is through conventions, annual events where people who share a love of these stories or a specific story gather to discuss and express their connections to them. Americans do the same for the American Revolution every July 4th and every time they visit places like Mount Vernon and Independence Hall or the Boston Freedom Trail. Another way that fans express their emotional connection to stories is by engaging in what's called cosplay, where they dress up as their favorite characters. And of course, Americans have a long tradition of reenacting in full costume Revolutionary War battles or moments like the crossing of the Delaware. We also see this in our political culture if we look back only recently to the Tea Party of the 2010s. Still another way that these emotional connections to stories are expressed is through fan fiction. There are whole websites devoted to fans writing their own stories featuring the characters from Star Wars or Harry Potter. This one website has 637,000 stories about Harry Potter written by fans. And Americans have done this too by creating and reading historical fiction, right? That stories set in the Revolutionary era, often featuring real life characters. And of course, one of the most popular of these was Johnny Tremaine. A fourth way that fans engage with stories is through fan art or creating artwork that depicts famous scenes from their stories. And of course, these are two examples, Trumbull and Lutz, two of the more famous examples. And this is not a comprehensive list, but a final way I will mention is that fans visit recreations of the world of their stories. Fans of Harry Potter can go to Universal Studios theme park and walk down Diagon Alley, and Lord of the Rings fans can go to New Zealand and visit the Shire. And the people visit them because they want to inhabit the stories that they love and that they have a connection to, because it strengthens their connection to them and to the community. And this is the same reason that people have long visited places like Colonial Williamsburg, the Boston Freedom Trail, or Independence National Historical Park. So we can see that many of the ways that Americans have celebrated or commemorated the revolution have similarities to these fan cultures, which are created when stories take hold of people's imaginations and they establish such deep emotional connections to these stories that they go on to form a part of their personal identity and they become part of a shared community. After all, nations are in no small part held together by the stories that they tell about themselves and their origins. In that sense, nations are as much a literary creation as they are a political creation. And this is not to expressly argue that nationalism is a form of civic fandom or that modern fandom has its roots in nationalism, but I think that the similarities suggest something even more elemental about how we as humans relate to stories, especially mythologized stories, and the effects that they have on us. And the power of the memory of the revolution, I want to suggest, comes in no small part because it is an origin myth told in the form of a hero myth. And this has contributed to Americans developing a unique emotional connection to the memory of the revolution over 2.5 centuries. There's another origin of the revolution's hold on the American imagination that goes back to a pre-revolutionary cultural inheritance from Britain. And that helps us understand not just Americans' connection to the memory of the revolution, but their use of it. In the 18th century, many British subjects believed that history was cyclical rather than linear. And that is, empires and civilizations rose when their people had a collective hunger for political power and economic prosperity. But then once a society achieved a level of power and prosperity, the people tended to become profligate and concerned with their own self-interest over the common good. And that led to their inevitable decline. So this cyclical cycle of empires rising and falling is how they understood how history worked. And so British thinkers in the early 18th century argued that the best way for any society to temporarily forestall its inevitable decline was by recommitting to its quote unquote first principles, right? For them, that meant the principles of the Glorious Revolution of 1688 But of course, since 1776, Americans have looked for their first principles in their own revolution. And the conflicts that I cover in my book that we have had over the meaning and the legacy of the founding for the last 250 years have really been in no small part about choosing and defining and justifying the most important first principles of the revolution. And so whether Americans are aware of it or not, we have sort of inherited and intensified this notion that there's a kind of protection in looking back to our founding. And this too, I think, helps explain our unusual emotional connection to it. But what Americans have done over the last 250 years with that emotional connection, what first principles they found in the revolution and used the revolution to justify, has varied as widely as the political spectrum. And that's because even within the general structures that I've laid out here, Americans have always selectively emphasized or ignored certain parts of the story or certain people to attribute a specific character or meaning to the revolution. That's what a popular memory is. It's a way of telling a story or interpreting a story to attribute specific meanings to it. And my book shows that Americans have interpreted the revolution and its meaning in many different and often directly conflicting ways. And most of them, even the ones that directly contradict one another, are rooted in the history of the revolution. And that is, they are to some extent, if not equally true, but none of them on their own are the whole truth. And that's because the revolution was too rich and complex an event that was carried out by too diverse an array of people to ever be distilled into a single story or narrative. After all, the founding generation themselves did not agree on what the revolution meant or what its first principles were. As Walt Whitman might say, the revolution contains multitudes. And that means that there is no single correct meaning or interpretation of the revolution. As a national origin myth, that complexity has allowed the popular memory of the revolution to constantly be contested and adopted by Americans across the political spectrum. And the meanings that we attribute to it reflect our own times and are typically intended to justify our previously held beliefs. And you might ask whether the fact that the memory of the revolution is used to justify beliefs rather than determine them somehow diminishes its importance. But I would argue that it actually makes it more important, because the memory of the revolution as our national origin story is not just a useful way to justify one's political beliefs. It's the ultimate way to justify one's beliefs. And that is something that has been a key role that the memory of the revolution has played in American politics from the start. How we talk about the revolution often reveals far more about the present than the past, far more about us than the revolution. And essentially, the revolution has provided a sort of shared political language that has mediated many of our most divisive and hard-fought political conflicts. And so let me give you an example of this. For much of the nation's first 50 years, the Declaration of Independence primarily symbolized independence from Britain and the Union of the States. For that reason, the most important part of it was the grievances and the final paragraph, right? The pledging of the sacred honor. It was not the preamble with its universal statement of rights and equality. That only began to come about in the 1930s with the rise of abolitionism. In fact, it was the abolitionist movement that created the modern memory of the Declaration as defined by the preamble and the principles of liberty and equality rather than independence and union. Abolitionist writers and orators repeatedly mentioned the Declaration, including notably in the first issue of The Liberator in 1831. This is the most important abolitionist newspaper of the era. In introducing this new publication in his first issue, William Garrison explained the symbolism behind publishing the newspaper in Boston. "I determined at every hazard," he wrote, "to lift up the standard of emancipation in the eyes of the nation within sight of Bunker Hill and in the birthplace of liberty." Then he continued, "Assenting to the self-evident truth maintained in the American Declaration of Independence, I shall strenuously contend for the immediate enfranchisement of our slave population." Abolitionist meaning in Vermont. passed a resolution stating slavery in 1833 is incompatible with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. The Old Colony Anti-Slavery Society of Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1839 resolved that the Declaration was, quote, the fundamental document of our national existence. In other words, the abolitionists defined the Declaration by the principle of equality, and they defined the revolution by the Declaration. This, of course, did not escape the notice of pro-slavery Southerners. In a newspaper in South Carolina in 1835, one pro-slavery writer made a common dismissal of the Declaration by saying that the phrase "all men are created equal" was just a rhetorical flourish, and claimed that, quote, "upon this proposition, false as it is, rest the wild theories of liberty held by so many," meaning abolitionism. In the hands of the abolitionists, Southerners claimed that the Declaration had become, quote, "a very seditious instrument." For them, the Constitution was the fundamental or defining document of the Revolution, not the Declaration. After all, the Constitution had been their best tool for protecting slavery through repeated compromises over new states being admitted to the Union to maintain congressional balance between slave and free states. Later, the Fugitive Slave Act, the Dred Scott case. And in the 1840s, Garrison and his followers also began to see the Constitution, like pro-slavery Southerners, as a fundamentally pro-slavery document. And that notion, this turn on their part, was stoked by the first publication of James Madison notes on from the Constitutional Convention, which was published for the first time in 1840. Until then, Americans had known very little about what had happened in the Constitutional Convention. But now they could read the debates over representation and the compromises that had been made to appease the slave states. In 1844, Wendell Phillips, a noted abolitionist, published a compilation of these portions of the notes that dealt with slavery, along with some of his own commentary, in a book called The Constitution, a Pro-Slavery Compact. The notes, he claimed, showed, quote, that most clearly the details of that compromise which was made between freedom and slavery in 1787. And the main audience that he was targeting were his fellow abolitionists, who had long argued that the revolution and the revolutionaries, including slaveholders like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, had been fundamentally anti-slavery. For Garrison, Phillips, and their followers, the Constitution was corrupted from the start because of this compromise. And as a result, Garrisonians began to call for disunion, because slavery could never be abolished under a constitution that began with compromises for slaveholders. Not all abolitionists agreed. In his famous speech on July 5th, 1852, in Rochester, New York, Frederick Douglass, who was a former ally of Garrison in the 1840s, said, quote, "I differ from those who charge this baseness on the framers of the Constitution. It is a slander upon their memory, and interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document." But the Garrisonian reinterpretation of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document spread in the 1850s, and it kind of culminated in a famous incident in on July 4th, 1854, in Framingham, Massachusetts. During his speech at this event, Garrison famously pulled out his pocket copy of the Constitution, which he called a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, and then set it aflame as the crowd cheered. These two founding documents were seen by both sides as fundamentally different and in opposition to one another. The Radical Declaration, with its pronouncements of liberty and equality, and the Constitution, which established and maintained law and order and slavery. And abolitionists and pro-slavery Southerners fought over which document and hence which principles defined the revolution, and by extension, the nation. In some sense, Republicans in the 1850s hoped that the Declaration would save the nation from the Constitution and slavery, while Southerners hoped that the Constitution would continue to save slavery from the Declaration. By the time of Lincoln's election and the secession that followed, Southerners' relationship to the Revolution became strained. In 1857, George Fitzhugh, a well-known pro-slavery Southern writer, had argued that liberty and equality are new things under the sun. In other words, liberty and equality were not principles of the revolution. They were new Northern principles that he blamed for all the problems that beset the North, including crime, immigration, and moral decay. And increasingly, pro-slavery Southerners came to see Jeffersonian democracy as having made abolition possible because it allowed for the tyranny of the majority. Slavery was under threat, they wrote, because Washington, Adams, and Hamilton had failed to limit the democratic principles of Jefferson. Jefferson was a, quote, fanatical political monomaniac who was, quote, the father of all the calamities that are now being visited upon the nation. And the Declaration they described as an instrument more properly expressive of the passionate and delirious ravings of a Parisian mob than the calm, dignified, and deliberate utterance of a nation. We can also think back to the cornerstone speech of Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, in March of 1861, when he declares that the Confederacy's cornerstone rests upon the idea of white supremacy, which he argued had been, quote, rejected by the first builders of the nation, and said that they had believed that slavery was in violation of the laws of nature. Those ideas, he said, were fundamentally wrong. And this is not just a direct rejection of the Declaration of Independence, which is also fascinating because this notion that the founders had been anti-slavery was a product of the sort of abolitionist memory of the revolution since the 1830s. But after a few decades, even Southerners had adopted that part of the abolitionist memory because it suited their agenda of secession to do so. As for the Constitution, Jefferson Davis said in 1861 that the Constitution framed by our fathers is that of these Confederate states. And much of it was copied verbatim with the key addition of protections for slavery. But a number of well-known Southern writers began to craft a new memory of the Constitution. They claimed that the founders never intended the Union to be perpetual, that the founders had signed on to the Constitution with the understanding that states could leave whenever they want. J.D.B. Du Bois, who's a well-known Southern writer, argued that the government created by the Revolution, quote, had the seeds of death planted in its Constitution because it tried to force together two fundamentally irreconcilable societies. Once it became clear that the Constitution might no longer protect slavery, it was no longer deserving of reverence. And arguments like these were highly charged, really as emotional as they were intellectual, precisely because that was needed to be able to convince fellow Southerners to break their unusual emotional connection to the revolution. And so ultimately, to establish a new nation, Southerners had to reimagine the origin myth of the United States in a way that would justify the creation of their own nation and serve as the basis for a Confederate origin myth. Now, this is one of many examples in my book of partisan conflicts over the memory of the revolution. But I want to give you a sense also of just how far across the political spectrum the memory of the revolution has been used, from the far left to the far right. In the 1930s, as part of its Popular Front strategy, the Communist Party of the United States of America used the founders and the memory of the revolution to redefine itself and its agenda as an extension of the nation's revolutionary ideals and heritage. They adopted the slogan, "Communism is the Americanism of the 20th century." And you can see it here combined with the famous late 19th century image of the spirit of 76. The CPUSA found great value in the nation having had revolutionary origins. And each July 4th called on Americans to, quote, remember that this country won its independence in a great liberating revolutionary struggle. As a group who wanted to see the end of economic classes, they adopted the Declaration of Independence as a radical expression of equality at the heart of the nation's founding. The Communist Party, they wrote, quote, continues the traditions of 1776. And the communists were the heirs of the patriots, and the, quote, economic royalists were the Tories. The party also adopted the memory of individual founders, particularly Thomas Jefferson, who the party leader, Earl Bradler, said was, quote, a revolutionist not one whit but Marx and Engels. Jefferson was no communist, he said, but the Communist Party can claim him as one of its principal precursors. We stand on Jefferson's shoulders. Browder would often repeat Jefferson's famous quotes about, God forbid we should ever be 20 years without a rebellion. And the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Then Browder would conclude that, quote, modern communists are actually much more conservative in their utterances than Jefferson. In 1943, the party renamed its workers' school in New York City the Jefferson School of Social Science. And it was in these years of the Popular Front that the Communist Party of the US enjoyed its widest following. At the same time, on the far right, the German-American Bund was an American pro-Nazi group led by German immigrants that was also using the memory of the revolution to aid in its causes of anti-Semitism and isolationism. Here you see its leadership on the left and the group on parade in New York City in 1937. The Bund's goal was to oppose American intervention in the coming war. And its leader, Fritz Kuhn, was a German immigrant who harnessed German Americans' anger over having been discriminated against since World War I. He was known for his rants about the, quote, Jewish-controlled media and the need to put America first. On the evening of February 20th, 1939, the Bund held a pro-America rally at the old Madison Square Garden to commemorate the birthday of George Washington. It was billed as a mass demonstration for true Americanism. Washington was a popular symbol for the Bund because of his farewell address, which famously called on future generations of Americans to stay out of European wars. More than 15,000 people attended this rally, where the stage featured an imposing backdrop with a 30-foot full-length image of George Washington, flanked on both sides by 1776 flags and swastikas. The speakers warned that, quote, we are utterly and completely disregarding the admonition of George Washington today. They blamed Jews, Democrats, and communists for the spread of radicalism and for disregarding the advice of the founders. In thick German accents, they called on true Americans to stand up for the Americanism which the founders of the government implanted in the nation. The Bund used Washington and the memory of the revolution for its purpose of isolationism, but also because they knew its emotional power. And they knew that that power would help them appeal to native-born Americans who were weary of such foreign organizations. And ultimately, they tried to convince Americans that Nazism was a continuation of the American Revolution, and a not insignificant number of Americans were persuaded. Between these two examples, I want to give you a sense of how the memory of the revolution has been used successfully, even by groups at the furthest ends of the political spectrum. And part of the reason for that is because of the unusual emotional connection that Americans have had to their revolution and the power of legitimacy that the revolution conveys in our political culture. But it's not just partisan division that can change the memory of the revolution or cause political conflicts to arise. So I want to tell you one more story about how international politics and foreign policy can do that too. This is Robert Goldstein. He was born to parents of German descent in California. He was a Jewish-American costumer in Los Angeles in the 1910s. He'd been a small investor in D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. And that film's success had convinced Goldstein that a similar large-scale historical epic about the American Revolution could be just as successful, if not more so. So he raised a large amount of funding for what would be the first full-length feature film about the American Revolution, which he would write, direct, and produce himself. His film was called The Spirit of 76, and it promised on the poster a historical romance dealing with the American Revolution and its causes. Goldstein debuted his film in Chicago in May of 1917, 1 month after the US had officially joined the war against Germany with its new ally, Great Britain. Throughout the 19th century, Britain had played the role of evil villain in the popular memory of the revolution. But after the turn of the 20th century, relations between the two countries had become more friendly. In attendance at the pre-screening in Chicago were some critics and the city's controversial police censor board. One of the critics wrote that the film, quote, inspires patriotism and should cause the red blood of any American to tingle. But the head of the censor board, a man named Major Metellus Lucullus Cicero Funkhauser, he disagreed. He objected to scenes that showed British atrocities during the war, including one scene where a British soldier ransacks an American house and is seen sticking a bayonet through a crib, a supposedly occupied crib. Another showed a British soldier assaulting a young American woman. These scenes, he said, would, quote, arouse bitterness and sectional feeling against England, now one of our allies in the present war. So Funkhauser seized the film and called the Justice Department. Eventually, Goldstein was allowed to show the film as long as he deleted these offending scenes. And we don't really know why, but before the film premiered proper in Los Angeles a few months later, Goldstein put the scenes back. He was arrested immediately after the movie was shown and charged under the Espionage Act, which had been passed just a few months earlier to crack down on public dissent against the war. Bail was set at $10,000. This is the headline from the LA Daily Times: War of Revolution film seized by government. The case went to trial and it was presided over by, I kid you not, Judge Benjamin Franklin Bledsoe, who agreed that the film would, quote, arouse our revenge and question the good faith of our ally, Great Britain. The trial began in the spring of 1918. Some believe that Goldstein was a German agent. Others believe that he was a bumptious ignoramus who was more fool than villain, in the words of the Daily Times. Newspapers reporting on the trial called the film German propaganda, impure and simple. And they included news about unrelated arrests of people accused of spying for Germany at the end of stories about the film in the trial. Goldstein was found guilty of treason under the Espionage Act and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and a $5,000 fine. Thanks to a post-war review of prosecutions under the Espionage Act, Goldstein was released early in 1921. And after an unsuccessful effort to try to revive the film, he essentially disappears from the public record. The last time that we see him is he actually turns up in Germany, in Nazi Germany in 1935, where he was arrested for being unable to afford to renew his passport. This story is an example of how the politics of the times shapes the ways that we remember the revolution. Goldstein thought he was making a patriotic film, and that was based on the memory of the revolution that he had learned when he was younger, in which Britain was the evil enemy. His story is also a reminder of the great power of the memory of the revolution that we learn when we are young, and of how difficult it can be to let that memory go as we get older and newer memories of the revolution emerge. Goldstein's great tragedy is that he was too slow to realize that the memory of the revolution was changing rapidly because of the war. That the old memory had not only become outdated, but legally treasonous. If he had released this film a few years earlier or a few years later, things likely would have turned out very differently for him. But instead, he was imprisoned as a traitor for making the first feature film about the American Revolution. And that film is lost to time because no copy of The Spirit of 76 has ever been found. So this is just one example of how foreign affairs can have an impact on the memory of the revolution. In my book, I also look at how the rise of the Cold War in the 1950s and the end of it in the 1990s also caused significant changes to how the revolution was remembered. So to conclude, I have tried to, in this talk, explore just what it means that we mythologize the revolution, how that has worked, and how it has sort of played out in the practice of American politics. At the heart of that importance is how we tell the story of the revolution. How we tell the story matters. And if readers should take anything away from this book, it should be a greater awareness of the importance of how we tell the story. Whether it's an unqualified triumph, a hypocritical failure, both somewhere in between. I've also tried to show how we have told that how we have told that story has fostered an unusual emotional connection to the revolution. And because the purpose of the national origin myth is to define and justify first principles and political agendas, conflicts over different memories of the revolution have been constant throughout American history. And that is because the revolution has provided us with this shared political language that allows it to be an important tool for communicating across the many divides inherent in such a diverse nation and polity. And ultimately, the memory of the revolution has been one of the most common ways that Americans have expressed their understanding of the present, their visions of the future, particularly as we continue to define the nation and what it means to be an American. And though the memory of the revolution seems to have done more to divide than unite us, I would suggest that fighting over the revolution is an expression of the civic engagement that's needed to maintain a democratic republic. Indeed, it's long been part of our birthright and our civic duty as American citizens to determine what the revolution means to us. And each new generation has produced multiple new memories of the revolution, often in direct conflict with one another. And as a result, we have always embedded in our memories of the revolution our grandest dreams and our highest aspirations, as well as our deepest fears and our ugliest prejudices. When Americans look at the revolution, we are effectively looking into a mirror. We define ourselves in part by how we define the revolution. We see ourselves in the revolution, and we see the revolution in ourselves. The revolution is always in the eye of the beholder, and though many may claim sole ownership of it, in a democracy, no one owns the past. The memory of the revolution belongs to each and every one of us to make of it what we will, for better and worse. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hattem. We will now take some questions from the audience. So if you do have a question, I'd ask that you please raise your hand and I will bring the microphone to you so our friends on Zoom can hear us.
You mentioned that we have a strong shared memory of the American Revolution. It seems that in today's society, we seem to have a stronger memory of the Civil War. And I don't know if that's eclipsed the American Revolution or degraded from that. What's your views on that?
That is a great question. Since it seems to me, since sometime in the mid-20th century, some people have wanted to see a contest between the Civil War and the American Revolution. That's why there are countless books calling the Civil War the Second American Revolution, right? But if you're doing that, you're already defining yourself on the terms of the American Revolution, right? The revolution is the nation's origin myth. The Civil War is an important step along the way. Some historians would argue that it fundamentally changes the nation going forward, right? And so that's their attempt to make the Civil War its own origin story, right? But that's not unusual. Americans have a sort of proclivity for origin stories, right? Columbus is an origin story, a very well-known origin story that has been used over time in many different ways. The first Thanksgiving is in some sense an origin story, right? But the revolution stands apart, I think, from all of them for the reason that it is most fundamentally the nation's the origins of the polity of the nation state. And so some people would argue it, but I don't see the Civil War as supplanting the revolution in terms of an origin story. Most recently, we can think of the 1619 Project as trying to offer a different founding date, right? But they're all doing it on the terms of the revolution, which shows its priority.
is it possible that all nations mythologize their revolutions?
Yeah, that's a great question too. Is it possible? Yes. But do we see that? Not like this. The way that the British treat the Glorious Revolution of 1688 is not like this. They don't argue about it this way. It doesn't play as central a role in their political culture over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years like this. It is an important, it's in some sense, it's more akin to the Civil War origin story than that. It's a change in direction. It's not the origin of Great Britain or England. They were not, Great Britain and England were not originated by revolutions, right? Even the Dutch Republic had a founding revolution, but again, it doesn't have this kind of role in their popular culture. And I would argue that a big part of that is down to the way that we tell the story. It also has to do, I think, in contrast with those, it's recency. The revolution, our national origins are within the realm of recorded history, unlike, say, for England, right? And in a lot of ways, I think some people might think, well, if the revolution was so recent and it was so exhaustively documented, wouldn't that make it less ambiguous? But it actually makes it more ambiguous. The more documents you have from the American Revolution, the more things the American Revolution can be, right? So those are some unique factors about the revolution relative to those others.
Right in back of the wall is Lafayette and his time and after he came back, and how the United States was the most unified because of that Lafayette myth. That Lafayette, all the things that he accomplished, and everywhere in the country, wherever he went, people were expanding into that myth, and it unified the country probably better than any other event in our history.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair statement. It's an accurate characterization of Lafayette's return. Lafayette's return is interesting in part because it happens just a few years after the first Pension Act for Continental Army soldiers, who after the Revolution, for decades after the Revolution, Continental Army soldiers, they were not celebrated, like in the way that we celebrate veterans of American wars today and have for centuries. The Continental Army soldiers came from the dregs of society. That's the terms that were used back then, right? The militias were the repository of civic virtue. They were, independent men who had their own farms, and they had families, they had a stake, and after their militia service, they would go back to their farms. That starts to change after 1812, after the War of 1812, and people start to have, because of the repeated fight against the British, they start to have a new respect for the Continental Army veterans, and as they start to realize that they're dying off pretty quickly. And that leads up to the Pension Act. And then Lafayette coming so shortly after that only reinforced the position, this newfound respect that the Continental Army soldiers had, because everywhere he went, he met with Continental Army veterans, right? Often giving them pride of place in parades and events. And so, to no small extent, Lafayette's visit, yes, it had a unifying effect on the country everywhere he went. It was one of the biggest media events of the early 19th century. But it also had this tremendous impact on sort of cementing the new respect and honor that Continental veterans were receiving in American life.
Dr. Hattem, we do have some
Yeah.
questions online, if you don't mind. One viewer, this is sort of a statement, then a question, about the way we remember and use the revolution today. Historians often lament that the Secretary of the Continental Congress ultimately decided to burn rather than publish his papers, which would have aired out a lot of dirty laundry about the revolution and the founding generation. If, over the last 2 centuries, everyone saw the revolution and our revolutionaries more clearly, warts and all, what difference do you think it would have made in how we use the memory of the revolution throughout our history?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. That is a really interesting question. I mean, it's akin to what I was talking about with Madison's notes of the Constitutional Convention, right? For a long time, people just did not have access to those notes in the way that we do now and have since 1840. I don't know that if Charles Thompson didn't burn his records from the Continental Congress, that it would have had any significant impact on how you remember the revolution necessarily. But what it would have done is it would have done what Madison's notes did, which was, provide some fuel for some fire, right? But I don't think it would have had a determinative effect on how the memory of the revolution was remembered, broadly speaking.
Thank you. One viewer would like to know, did the founders use the memory of the revolution when the first political parties were forming?
Yeah, the memory of the revolution very much was a part of the politics in the 1790s, the politics of the first party system. The Federalists and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans had very different understandings of what the revolution was. For the Federalists, the revolution was an event that had ended, right? For Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, the revolution was something that was ongoing. And that's why I saw the politics of the 1790s and their conflicts with Hamilton and Hamiltonian Federalists as, fighting to secure the American Revolution. That's the kind of phrase that they would use, right? So yeah, the memory of the revolution was very much at stake in the 1790s in the first party system. We can see that in ways that there were significant conflicts, most notably in 1795, over July 4th celebrations, right? And so you would have wherever it was, I mean, in cities, even in local towns, if you would have Federalists and Democratic Republicans vying for control of the July 4th festivities, right? To be able to define the revolution through those festivities in a way that matched their party's principles. For Jeffersonians, that would mean, often having, a parade was common for July 4th back then even, would be to feature local mechanics in the parade, right? Whereas, Federalists' parades would consist of, all the political leaders and the economic leaders of a local community. So yeah, we absolutely see the memory of the revolution being contested even by these two political parties, that were led by men who had fought in the revolution or contributed to the revolution, right?
Thank you. And there's a few questions here, basically asking the same thing. We obviously have a big celebration coming up in the next couple of years here. How do you think that the 250th celebration falls into this whole narrative of the memory of the revolution?
My book goes up to 2001. And the epilogue talks a little bit about the intervening years. I will say, I can't predict the 250th anniversary. But I will tell you that there are a fair number of similarities between the 250 and the bicentennial. I like to think of the bicentennial as an era, the long bicentennial era. because it's not just 1976, not just the anniversary of independence. There's all kinds of revolution-related events that come in the decade after, all the way up to the bicentennial of the Constitution in 1987, which was quite a big deal, and the Bill of Rights later in 1989. So I think of the bicentennial era as long, and I think of its beginning as having started with a Broadway musical, with 1776, which debuts in 1969. In some sense, historians may look back and say that the long 250th anniversary era started also with a Broadway musical in Hamilton, right? Which was also some years before the actual anniversary. Both the bicentennial and the 250 are occurring in the wake of unprecedented presidential scandals, right? They both are occurring, have occurred, and are now occurring when the country is experiencing unprecedented levels of distrust in institutions, right? They both came in the wake of economic recessions, right? At a time when there was significant growth in social movements. So I think that those are all similarities between the 250th and the bicentennial. That doesn't mean that they're going to play out in the same way. But it's also, you could take a number of those similarities that I just said and apply them to the centennial in 1876, the economic recession, the panic, right? The scandal over the election, right? Social movements even. Not a musical. There was no musical for the centennial. I will say too, I've sort of noticed over time that the fights that we tend to have over the revolution, that they intensify when certain circumstances exist, you know, in times of high political partisanship, in times of near or around economic recessions, in times of high immigration or perceived high immigration. You know, these are common circumstances in the times when our fights over the revolution get even more virulent and seem to have higher stakes. And I think, you know, each of those circumstances is essentially happening now. And so I think we're approaching the 250th as sort of a perfect storm for having a high sense of the stakes involved in what the revolution means around the anniversary.
And I think that's the best and perfect spot to wrap up. So, Dr. Hattem, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming in person and online at home.
Thank
Go
you.
out and get yourself a copy, The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History, and get home safe. We'll see you next time. Thanks again.